So I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the king's successor do? Only what has already been done. And then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same fate befalls all of them. Then I said to myself, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said to myself, this also is futile. For there is no enduring remembrance of the wise or fools, seeing that in the days to come, everything will be long forgotten. How can the wise die, just like fools? And so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is futile, and a chasing after wind. I hated all my toil with which I toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to my successor, and who knows whether he'll be wise or foolish, and yet he'll be master of all, that from which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. And this also is futile. And so I turned and I gave my heart up to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes the one who toils with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave it all to be enjoyed by another who has not toiled for it. This also is futile and an awful injustice. What do mortals earn with all their toil and striving with which they toil under the sun? For their days are full of pain, and their work is a frustration. And even at night, their mind does not rest. This also is futile. There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and enjoy and find enjoyment in their toil. This also, I saw, was from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the work of amassing wealth, only to give it to the one who pleases God. This also is futile and a chasing after wind. In this section from Ecclesiastes, I had one significant challenge that I needed to work through. And that is, as I read and learned and tried to tell this passage, there were parts of it that just didn't make sense to me. They didn't feel right. They didn't feel comfortable. I was having trouble even remembering them. And I started to notice that it's the places where the preacher, the teacher of Ecclesiastes, seems to disagree with himself or contradict himself or say things that don't match up with the general drift or the general idea of the whole passage. And so I started to look at those sections a little more closely and begin to imagine, what if what's happening here is that the teacher is quoting some well-known words of wisdom and then offering his response to them. Then, if that's the case, things started to click in place, and the passage started to make more sense to me, and I could tell it in a way that was natural and felt right. It made sense. So I had to then think, all right, how am I going to communicate to my audience that what I'm doing here is I'm actually quoting traditional wisdom? And then responding to that traditional wisdom. Well, in most settings that you might tell the story, one way to do that, and the way I chose to do it, was to have a Bible, right? A kind of symbol of the tradition that has been passed down to God's people. And so I chose for certain lines to read from the Bible rather than to appear to be telling it from memory. Now, a little tip here, I just opened my Bible more or less to a random place and was still telling it from memory as I looked down at my Bible and pretended to be reading. And that might have not been the best choice because it actually was quite distracting to look down and see other words than the words that I was saying. So if you're going to try something like this, I might recommend you actually turn to the part in your Bible that has the words you're looking at and maybe even highlight those to avoid that bit of distraction that might cause you to stumble. But that was my choice. And so, for example, I looked down and was reading when I spoke the words. I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but the fools walk in darkness. And for me, this language echoes Proverbs. Right? Within the wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, there are different traditions of wisdom. And you have some traditions, like what we often find in Proverbs, that communicate in a kind of simple, crude way, if I can put it in a crude way anyway, that those who do good will be blessed, and those who do evil will face punishment. Therefore, you should do good and serve God and be faithful to God, and that will lead to a good life and blessings for you. So there's kind of this almost simplistic understanding of things that's being expressed. And then there are other wisdom literature books like Ecclesiastes or Job that come into play and say, yeah, but that's not actually how it often plays out. And so as I was working through this passage in Ecclesiastes, I noticed what I thought were bits of traditional wisdom that sounded like Proverbs. And so I could pretend to read those bits, and then I could kind of respond to them as the teacher. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. Yeah, but I perceive the same fate befalls all of them. Right? So there's kind of this call and response. Right? There's Proverbs being given space, and then the teacher responding and say, yeah, that's not as accurate as it might sound on its face. I think the first instance at the beginning was more obvious. It was a little bit more challenging then to imagine how that might work at the end. I still felt that tension in the last section of what I told. I still felt like there was some other traditional wisdom being cited, but you'll notice at the end I actually kind of begin reading, interrupt a little bit, and then return to reading, and that's what made the best sense to me. Right? There is nothing better for mortals than to eat, drink, and find enjoyment in their toil. Kind of imagine this being read, and then the teacher kind of looking up and saying, yes, this also I saw was from the hand of God. Kind of a little aside in the middle of it, and then returning to read. For to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and heaping, only to give it to the one who pleases God. So again, this estimation that the way the world works is that God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to those who please him, and to those who are sinners, right? He kind of takes away their things and gives it to the good. That understanding of how the world works, I don't think fits with what the teacher says throughout the rest of Ecclesiastes. And so I have the teacher reading it and then looking up and responding, yeah, this too is futile. The kind of refrain that he announces for all sorts of things. So I think that's one of the biggest decisions I made and one of the biggest challenges I had in telling this particular passage. The other significant challenge that telling any part of Ecclesiastes presents is what to do with the language of futility or vanity. So you might get vanity of vanities, everything is meaningless. The translation I actually went with for this particular telling, I actually borrowed it from a different translation. So I was working primarily with the CEB, but then went to another translation to borrow the word futile. That just worked a little bit better for me in terms of trying to communicate what I think the teacher is expressing here. And for me, the idea that I'm hearing expressed is this idea that there are lots of things that we might try to hold on to and cling to that we think will give us meaning, that we think will give us security, that we think will make sure that we can assure ourselves the good life that we want, and yet we find in the end that kind of trying to cling to these things ends up being futile, right? We find ourselves holding on to nothing, chasing after the wind. as the author says. And so I chose that kind of gesture. I chose futile, and I chose this kind of gesture, this idea of trying to grip and hold on to, only to find in the end your hands are empty. It didn't work. And so I could use that, I could follow the repetition of that language with the repetition of the gesture. And even in some places where the language wasn't as obvious, where the verbal link wasn't as clear, but I felt that the author was communicating the same thing, I could again kind of use that same gesture. And one thing I noticed as I started to use that gesture to connect different parts of this particular section of Ecclesiastes, one thing I noticed is that I think the teacher here kind of crescendos up to this point of, kind of working himself up and then realizing it's futile, and then kind of sitting back, starting again, kind of working himself up, working himself up, working himself up, kind of sitting back, starting in again, working himself up. I kind of felt this rhythm of this crescendo, this rising, this building tension that then is kind of released at each announcement of this too is futile. And so that helped provide some of the movement that I saw in this passage, and kind of the gesture, and then also maybe the pace and the tension I can put in my voice. If I could show that kind of building up to this point where he realizes it's all futile, I could, as a storyteller, communicate, again, the rhythm and the structure and the tone that I see in this particular passage of Ecclesiastes.